This is an alternate history scenario on what if the Russian Revolution never happened. Point of departure for this scenario is Tsar Alexander's death in 1894, which doesn't happen in this world, and he lives longer so he can train his son Nicholas to be a proper successor to the Russian throne. In 1904, Russia saw itself in conflict with the growing empire of Japan. Japan managed to destroy the Russian Pacific Fleet, as well as conquer all of Korea and parts of southern Manchuria. During this war, Russian generals suggested sending the Baltic Fleet around the world to the Pacific to defeat the Japanese. But Tsar Alexander realized that winning this war against Japan was unfeasible, and decided to concede and make peace with Japan, allowing them to take all of Korea and some of southern Manchuria, including Port Arthur. But this would also allow Russia to not risk its remaining fleet and keep most of Manchuria. During this time, Russia was also seeing an increase in unrest in the country. Tsar Alexander knew that something needed to be done about this, so he took a hardline stance on minority groups and terrorist organizations, oppressing minority groups such as the Poles, Armenians, and Jews in an attempt to snuff out any groups that could cause problems when it came to the Tsar's authority. He also had a policy of Russification of the empire, enforcing Russian language and Orthodox Christianity, diminishing any opposition to the Tsar even further. He did, however, give some powers to the newly formed Duma to show the Russian people that he did acknowledge that many wanted more power granted to the people. Economic policy and internal policy would be controlled much more by the Duma, but when it came to foreign policy and having the last say, the Tsar was still in control. Oppressed minority groups wouldn't have any representation either, but this did give the majority Russian population more faith in Alexander and his government. Alexander also helped push growing anti-Semitism among the Russian people, justifying many of his oppressive policies. Russia had become much more democratic, although at the cost of oppressing minorities, and forcefully assimilating many into Russian culture. In the early 1910s, Tsar Alexander had been pushing to industrialize Russia quite a bit, and it was clear Russia would eventually become a massive industrial power, although it was still far behind other European powers, being much more agricultural, as industrializing such a massive country would take time. Despite that, what Russia really had going for it was a massive army outnumbering every other European power. The Great War began in 1914, when the Archduke of Austria, Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated, and Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia along with its ally Germany. This pulled Russia and France into the war, and when Germany invaded France through Belgium, the British Empire joined as well. The war quickly turned into a stalemate, with horrible trench warfare. The Allies held off Germany in the west, and the Russians were able to hold off the Germans in the east. On the Eastern Front, Russia saw pretty heavy casualties, but thanks to the industrialization efforts of Tsar Alexander, the Russian army performed moderately okay, compensating for its subpar industrialization and weapons with sheer numbers. The Russians were never able to inflict any real defeat to the Germans in the east, but the Central Powers eventually lose, as their allies in Turkey were crippled by the Allied powers, and the Western Front moved closer and closer to Germany as American troops were arriving and the tides were clearly turning. The war did take a toll on Russia. Historians even speculate that if it wasn't for Tsar Alexander's industrialization efforts and harsh oppression of any opposition to the government in the previous decades, the country might have fallen into civil war or revolution like in France a century before. But Russia came out victorious along with the Allies. After the war, the Allies decided that German-occupied Poland would become a free nation, which Russia hesitantly agreed to, as Poland likely would have fought for independence regardless. And in compensation, Russia was given some Austro-Hungarian land, which had a large Ukrainian population. Germany was now a fair bit smaller, and the rest of Austria-Hungary was turned into several independent nations based on their respective ethnic and linguistic groups. In 1921, Tsar Alexander died, and his son, now Tsar Nicholas, who had been observing his dad for decades and learning from him, took over as the country's monarch. Under Tsar Nicholas in the 20s and early 30s, Russia continued its industrialization and Russification, which made the country much more powerful and rich, and also spread Russian language and Orthodox Christianity to much of its territory east of the Urals. Finland and the Baltic states also saw their Russian population grow significantly over this period. Russia was far more prosperous than ever for Russians, but also more racist and oppressive towards minorities than ever, having expelled almost all of its Jewish citizens by this point. Although Nicholas did grow to have more sympathy for the Russian people, and changed his views with time, as he saw the success of Western democracies. Thus he gave the Duma more power than it had under his father's reign. Russia had also become more isolationist during this period, due to the cost of the Great War. and it was no longer allied with France. By the mid to late 30s, Russia had industrialized much more, still being behind the European powers, but slowly catching up. Due to the harsh treatment of Germany after the war, fascism was growing in the newly founded republic. Its fascist party wanted to conquer its lost lands and reunite with the German diaspora living across Eastern Europe. Fascism was also on the rise in Italy, where the name actually came from. There was also a small, yet unsuccessful fascist movement in Russia, but the Tsar, being more sympathetic to the democratic monarchies in the West, saw them as a threat to Russia, and his government spread anti-fascist propaganda, clearly showing their lack of support for the movement. This is possibly the reason the movement never grew as it did in Germany. When the fascist party in Germany took over, they essentially made the country into a one-party dictatorship and went on to militarize the country despite the terms of the Treaty of Versailles from the Great War. The allies of the UK and France wanted to avoid war, so they went with a strategy of appeasement, allowing Germany to unify with Austria and retake German lands in Czechoslovakia, with a promise that they wouldn't invade the rest of the country. Then Germany invaded the rest of the country. The allies made it clear that this was the last straw, and if they invaded Poland or anything else, it would mean war. Then the Germans invaded Poland, and this resulted in France and the UK declaring war on Germany, thus starting the Second World War in 1939. Germany performed much better than in the First World War with their strategy of blitzkrieg and use of tanks. They quickly conquered all of Poland before the end of the year, then invaded Denmark and Norway, which they quickly conquered, and then went on to push through the Netherlands and Belgium into France, which was under German occupation by June 1940. By September 1940, the Axis powers, an alliance between the expansionist and authoritarian Italy, Germany, and Japan, had been formed. The Germans contemplated war with Russia, but planned to win against the Allies in the West first, as they didn't see the already anti-Semitic and still mostly authoritarian Russia as an immediate threat. They decided Russia would be dealt with after forcing the Allies to capitulate. Things didn't go to plan, however, as the Germans were slowly losing their important oil-rich territories in the Middle East to the Allies, and by 1943 they were pushing up through Italy into Europe. By April 1944, Russia had been industrializing and mobilizing their military more and more, as they knew the Germans would eventually invade. So Tsar Nicholas decided to strike first, as it was the perfect opportunity to do so, right when the Germans were already struggling against the Allies in Italy. Russia began pushing into Poland and East Prussia. Meanwhile, the Allies had prepared for an invasion of Normandy in the west, which was successful. The Russians pushed the front line into German-occupied territory and saw success in southeastern Europe, but did struggle somewhat in Poland and Germany proper. This was only until October 1944, when the Allies in the West had liberated France and Belgium, and were pushing the Germans on the Western Front. Then the Russians in the East and the Allies in the West pushed Germany from both sides rapidly, and by July 1945, they met in Germany and Western Poland, and all of Europe had been liberated. This only left Japan, which the Russians were slowly pushing out of Manchuria. Meanwhile, the Americans were island hopping in the Pacific. The war concluded when the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the war was finally over. Following the war, the borders in East Asia would return to what they were pre-World War II, except Russia would regain all of Manchuria, Korea would be independent, and Japan would lose most of its Pacific islands to the United States. In Europe, Germany would be occupied by the Allied powers of France, Britain, the United States, and Russia, Berlin being jointly occupied by all of them. By 1949, a new German republic based on the United States would be established out of the occupation zones. Russian-occupied Poland would be established as an independent nation, and some German lands would be given to neighboring countries. Russia, being in a great position after the war, established the Eurasian Alliance, which was a military alliance and sphere of influence based around Russia and Eastern Europe. The weary United States and Western Europeans established NATO in response, although in the coming decades, Russia insisted on a policy of peaceful coexistence and grew closer to the West both culturally and economically. Tsar Nicholas also acknowledged the growth and popularity of democracy in Russia and deemed it inevitable that the country would eventually go down that path. It was just a question of whether or not it would be a peaceful transition or not. So Tsar Nicholas eventually conceded more and more power to the Duma and the new democratic institutions, which led to Russia becoming a fully fledged parliamentary democracy with a symbolic monarch, just like its Western European neighbors. Russia prospered in the 50s and 60s, just as Western Europe and America did, and it saw massive economic growth, as well as a population boom. This was, however, also the time when the Republic of China would begin to grow in power and wealth in East Asia, leading to a world split between three major powers and their spheres of influence. Russia generally siding with the United States and Western Europe, as the Republic of China was far from an actual democracy and was really more similar to the fascist governments in Europe before the war. These three powers competed economically, militarily, and in space. Russia was the first to send a satellite and a man into orbit. Meanwhile, the United States landed the first man on the moon, and Russia the first woman. China was catching up to the other powers by the mid-70s, and the space race continued with the three powers establishing space stations and later moon bases. By the early 2000s, things were taking a turn, however, as the authoritarian bloc based around China, with other major powers such as India, was surpassing Russia and America on their own in wealth and had a massive population advantage. This led to the Eurasian Alliance and NATO merging, and the creation of the Western and Eastern Free Trade Zones, later named Western and Eastern Unions. These unions formed their own parliaments, and would by 2010 have complete freedom of movement within them, as well as open trade. The two unions are closely tied to one another economically and cooperate militarily, as all members of both are in the merged NATO and Eurasian Alliance, now called the Alliance of Democratic Nations. This would tip the scales of power somewhat in favor of the democracies of the world, and is the situation we've been until this day, with there being three major powers and a Cold War and clash of ideologies between the heavily populated and authoritarian Asia and rich and democratic Europe, United States, and Russia, both competing in terms of military capabilities, sending people to Mars, as well as asserting their presence on the moon and militarizing space. It can only be speculated how this will end. What can be said is that the 21st century has become the beginning of a new era, where if we don't blow each other up, humanity will explore and spread throughout the solar system, with Russia, along with the United States and China, being on the forefront. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more content like this in the future, and stay tuned for part 2 of this scenario, which will focus on Russia and the Eastern or Eurasian Union today. See you then.